In the land down under, where the winds blow free, lies a tale of railways, a turbulent history. Since 1863, they've rolled on the tracks, moving people and goods, never looking back. They built this country, connected it all, provided the lifeline for both big and small. But short-sightedness and self-interest prevail. Railways not fully developed, potential derail. Steel tracks and dreams running side by side, carrying hopes and aspirations through the countryside. Though they play a minor role, their spirit remains the heart of the railways, forever in our veins.
I hope you liked this jingle about the history of railways in New Zealand. I asked an artificial intelligence program to write it for me specifically for the series on the history of passenger trains in New Zealand. Well, last time I discussed the period from 1920 to 1934, and I outlined how road transport became more and more competitive. One thing that I left out is the Great Depression, which happened during the very late 1920s into the 1930s. At that time, the government of New Zealand decided to react to the depression with austerity measures, and they cut a lot of funding for railway infrastructure. Quite a few railway lines as a result were not built, so the connections were not made. For example, that was on the west coast between Westport and Inangahua, that wasn't continued, or on the South Island east coast, the railway line between Picton and Christchurch, the central part around Kaikoura wasn't connected. Similarly, the railway line from the Nelson province to the west coast between Kavatiri and Inangahua was not continued, and also the railway line between Gisborne and Napier was not completed, the last section. There were also some other cuts in Northland and south from Rotorua. All this cessation of the construction of railway lines was not just to cut public expenditure, but also because the government of the day did not really support rail. It had already seen what competition by road transport could do to rail, and they thought there was no future in railways at that time. Also, they did not think there was a need to transport anything from the northern part of the west coast to the southern part of the west coast, or there wouldn't be much traffic between Picton and Christchurch. So to them, all these, the little traffic that would eventuate could be carried by road or by ship, so why would you spend so much on the railways? Anyway, in 1935, the first Labour government was elected in New Zealand, and things changed dramatically for rail at that time. The first thing that happened was that construction was taken up again, particularly, for example, between Inangahua and Westport. Also, the line between Christchurch and Picton was completed. Similarly, the line between Napier and Gisborne. There was also construction in Northland, and also some construction in Wellington and south of Auckland. For some reason, the railway line between the Nelson province and the west coast, even though it was nearly completed already before the United government decided not to continue that, somehow that was not completed. Whatever your politics these days, in the late 1930s, the Labour government was very good for railways in New Zealand in contrast to earlier and later governments. New powerful steam locomotives were introduced, such as the Ka class here, which was a development of the K class from the early 1930s. The new J class locomotives were imported from Britain. Among development in signaling equipment, there were also new electric units introduced in Wellington, and diesel railcars that were actually quite successful, that also operated mainly in the southern North Island. Because the railway workshops were already quite busy, more railcars for the South Island were ordered from the Vulcan foundry in England. 10 of these railcars were ordered and built, but only 9 of them arrived in New Zealand. The 10th one was lost at sea when the ship that was carrying the railcar was shot down by a German submarine attack. And here we are on the topic that determined railways in New Zealand from the end of the 1930s onwards. This was the Second World War, which affected manpower quite significantly in New Zealand. This meant that the government had to prioritize. So, for example, a new line between Pōkeno, just south of Auckland, and Pairua was cancelled, and another line in the eastern Bay of Plenty. But the work continued on closing some of the gaps, particularly between Oahu and Kaikoura, and then on the Gisborne line. On the rolling stock front, not much steel could be spared for new locomotives and carriages, but some still continued to be built during the war. The railways were worn out during those war years, with not enough maintenance done, and staff and rolling stock and infrastructure pressed to their very limit. After the war, there were severe coal shortages, but also shortages of petrol and tires. That meant that the railways, first of all, restricted services, but that some services continued because the alternative bus service was also not feasible due to the shortage of petrol and tires. Somehow it was easier to get petrol and tires for private vehicles. That's one of the reasons why motor vehicle transport became very important in New Zealand, in contrast to public passenger transport. Another factor was that after the war, American city planning became quite influential in New Zealand, and that was focused on the modern motor car rather than the railways. So motorways and roads were built throughout the country, particularly in Auckland. This was even further entrenched through the election of a national government in 1949. The change of government also had a deep effect on the railways itself. In the 1940s, were plans to electrify large parts of the New Zealand railway system, but with the change of government and the change of management within New Zealand Rail, the electrification plans were shelved, and rather the emphasis was put on buying new diesel locomotives from the United States and Canada. And through that, over time, the steam engines were replaced, but they were replaced with diesel engines rather than electric. And that has consequences to this day. So after the great promises for the railways in the late 1930s in New Zealand, it floundered somewhat in later years. And that was mainly due to outside influences. Nevertheless, a good overall network was built during that time as well. So as the train vicar, I want to draw a quick analogy. Those things can also happen in our personal lives and in the church. We need to use the good times to build up our faith so that we can endure even in the more difficult times when there will be many challenges, often coming from the outside.
In the land down under, where the winds blow free, lies a tale of railways, a turbulent history. Since 1863, they've rolled on the tracks, moving people and goods, never looking back. They built this country, connected it all, provided the lifeline for both big and small. But short-sightedness self-interest prevail. Railways not fully developed, potential derail.